it used to be thought that the genes and genomes are given once and for all, and then it's like a divine lottery, and according to the genes you receive, then that's your destiny. And of course, it's not like that. People already have said, well, the environment matters a great deal, except that, yes, they pay obeisance to the environment, but they still say, after all, it is down to your genes, isn't it? So that was really like part of the folklore, part of the myth, because it happens to be very convenient for the ruling classes that it is so. By birth, you have a right to rule, and therefore, you've got good genes, and therefore, you shouldn't be ruling all the time, and people who have got nothing, they only got their bad genes to blame. So this was all very good for the status quo. And you see, unfortunately, if you take the scientific evidence seriously, ever since the mid-1970s, it all started to go wrong, to unravel, as it were. And ironically, that's when genetic engineering began, because after decades of DNA research, they pinned down the genetic material, it's DNA. And therefore, they think by manipulating this, by chopping and changing the DNA, making new combinations and then putting it into new organisms, into, say, a maize plant, or maybe a pig, or anything, you can create new organisms to serve our every need. So that was really the ideology behind it, that because the genes govern everything, then in order to, you can just change the genes, the genetic makeup and of any organism, and then presto, you're going to have a new kind of organism that will maybe be resistant to insects. Maybe you can apply herbicides, tolerant to herbicides. You can then apply herbicides and kill off everything, and that's your problem solved. And unfortunately, starting in the mid-1970s, geneticists found that not only are the functions of the genes change in relation to the environment, but also the structure of the genes themselves could be changed. The DNA sequence, the sequence of bases that is supposed to determine which gene it is, that can change too in response to the environment. And starting in the mid-1970s, they were just bowled over. There was every week, there was something new reported in the scientific literature that turned the whole world of genetics upside down. And by the 1980s, early 1980s, they already invented the term the fluid genome in order to try and encapsulate this masses of findings that said, the genes aren't actually given once and for all. My God, they actually respond in substantial ways to the environment. And then if you really follow that whole logic through, you realize that there is no way that just because you have good genes, they pretend, you can be resistant to everything, you can just pollute your environment with impunity, and your genes will protect you. Well, it isn't like that. Now we actually know that those toxins, those industrial chemicals, hormone disruptors and things like that, one of the things they do, which hasn't been mentioned, is that they also scramble your genes. And that the only way to keep your genes and genome healthy is if you have a balanced ecology. So, in fact, the genetics of the fluid genome is like the most holistic genetics, but the scientific mainstream, those people who have invested billions into genetic engineering haven't caught up to it. They're still, fooled by this idea that there is genetic determinism. One gene determines one character in like a straightforward linear causal chain. Instead, the whole thing is just everything is interconnected with everything else, and you cannot separate out the environmental and genetic influences. And which is why they came unstuck. The biotech industry is now failing rapidly. It's not only market rejection, it's that they've got a high failure rate, and what they create is not stable. And for a long time, there was a big denial going on because they decided to keep this from the public. They won't mention it. But in 2001, the European Union, the European Commission, they passed a new rule, and that says, okay, the companies have to submit data showing that this piece of DNA, this piece of new genetic material, they put into an organism like a maize plant or a cotton plant or whatever to make a new variety. That's got to be shown to be stable, that it's got to be in the same form, in the same place in the genome before they can be approved. So then government scientists from France started independently checking whether the company's story is correct. And in 5 out of 5 cases, they found it had rearranged themselves. This GM insert has rearranged themselves. It's no longer the same. Now, this is very significant because there is no way that the genetic engineer in the laboratory can control where in the genome and in what form this foreign DNA lands. And according as to where it has landed, it gives a different variety with very different characteristics, especially as far as safety is concerned. So you could have unexpected allergens, you could have toxins arising that you didn't suspect before, all kinds of unexpected effects. So, quality control is impossible. People aren't stupid. They know exactly what's going on, and people like myself and others are really independent scientists because a lot of us have been driven out of our academic institutions because we want to inform the public properly. And so this kind of thing is now well known, and which is why the industry is failing fundamentally. There is also a very interesting ideology that goes along with this kind of genetic determinism. I've already mentioned it before, that by birth, you are by birth, what you are. And it is something called the Darwinian theory, neo-Darwinian theory of natural selection, which again reinforces that. It says, if you've got good genes, you will be selected, you will be, selected by nature, so-called natural selection. And hence, again, you can see that it reinforces this. You see, you are where you are because you got good genes. You are a king because you got good genes. You're a pauper because you got bad genes, and you're being selected out. So no complaints. So again, it's this kind of ideology that's based on competition. You see, competition now is ruling the world. We have ministries of competition. We haven't got hardly any ministries of cooperation as far as I know. So it is this kind of ideology that is ruling society. That there is no society, by the way, no society, no ecosystem, because every individual is out for himself or herself, and all the species are fighting each other. So this is a kind of horrible world horrible Darwinian world in which we live. And it is quite clear that this kind of ideology is guiding the World Trade Organization, this neoliberal ideology, economics, which is, again, there's a lot of things wrong with it, but part of it is just, this emphasis on competition. The other thing wrong with it also is that exploitation rules, that it's actually, that it doesn't actually acknowledge that you cannot have a theory of economic theory that ignores the time scale on which nature regenerates. It treats as though everything has to grow continuously. Now, nothing grows continuously except for cancer. So we have an ideology which is like a huge cancer on society, and we've been dominated by this kind of ideology in every field. It's the mainstream, they have this kind of knowledge system that reinforces each other, and everything else is thrown out. I'm a very unusual kind of scientist, even if I may say so myself, because I have changed fields very often. I'm interested in art, I'm interested in literature, but wherever I go, well, anthropology, everything, but wherever I go into each field, I find myself at odds with the mainstream. And I used to think I must be crazy until when I got old enough and realized that actually all these, they go like that together. They reinforce each other, and they have the same roots. Because science is not independent of society. Like Darwinian theory arose out of this whole general ideology in Victorian England, where military might and competition and everything is supposed to be the thing that drives progress. You cannot get away with it from it. And so this Darwinian science then is imported back to support the rest of the knowledge system.